Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Hacienda Esmeralda Reina 415 wash processed Panama from Say Coffee. There's the box right there. And Say, based out of Brooklyn, New York. And they're a coffee roaster that's already appeared on this channel a couple of times this year. But a lot of people will know that this is the coffee I'm most excited to discuss, as washed Panamanian geishas are my favorite coffee in the entire world. And I do have a very strong affinity for those that come from the Peterson estate, as we've reviewed every Hacienda Esmeralda washed Panamanian geisha that Say has released over the last couple of years, including the Latte Tumaco, which was one of my favorite coffees from the entirety of 2021. So I'm definitely very excited to discuss this one today, as this right here is day 44. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, as I mentioned in the past, Say does roast on the lighter side of things, and oftentimes I feel like with some of their higher end coffees, they do go a little lighter on that roast profile as well. So this one does feel a little lighter than some of the coffees we've reviewed from them recently. It's still not necessarily in the ultra light category, but definitely still on the lighter side of things by most standards and metrics. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 19, first impression, and we opted for the V60 as the cup felt like it probably needed a little bit more time, as it came out pretty delicate, though it was offering a fair bit of the expected vibrancy and intensity in terms of the notable stone fruit aspect of this cup. Some additional components included a high level of florality, a slight herbality, a very mild citrus, but for the most part, a pretty solid start. I just felt like this coffee probably needed a fair bit more time's rest. Day 22 opted for the Chemex, and the cup came out nice again, as it continues to offer immense clarity with enough intensity to balance out the delicacy of the cup. Felt ever so slightly grainy, if not necessarily the most crystal clear, clean Panamanian geisha ever. It was at least presenting a much more floral forward cup with a slightly tropical sweet attribute to it. Not quite as good on the second impression. We continue on to day 25, opted for the April brewer, and the cup continues to offer that ever so slight grainy quality right off brew, as it does open up a lot more on the cool down, though it does remain a little bit more tame and delicate in general. There is a slightly sweeter stone fruit present and a slightly higher than expected level of brightness as well that continues to hold nice potential for this cup in general. But for the most part, it continues to remain pretty moderate. So this was another solid, if not necessarily spectacular day. And I was thinking a couple of things on this day as well, and I said, this coffee just seems to offer some really nice potential. I feel like we're on the verge of maybe unlocking a little bit more of that. And on day 28, we were able to experience a fair bit more, as we opted for higher temperatures and a more fine grind. It was notably improved, as it was offering much more intensity, as it had better sweetness and definition, as the profile skewed a little bit more in the floral direction, with an abundance of the listed jasmine aspects of this one, and a bit of a citric attribute to the extent of a near Fruity Pebbles like experience, as that's what I kept taking away from those earlier impressions, is that we're getting this slight grain quality, we're getting a slight citric quality. If we can get a little bit more sweetness and we can get those things together, then we are probably going to get that cereal attribute that I do associate with a lot of Panamanian geishas, most specifically those that come from the Hacienda Esmeralda coffees. So this was the best day of this coffee by a distance, but the best of it was still yet to come, as we continue on to day 31. Opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this offered tremendous clarity. So I think this is probably the cleanest we'd experienced from this coffee, with much more of a creamy vanilla aspect to the cup. A slight bit more graininess in the classic citric sense, but for the most part, a very nice coffee overall. We continue on to day 34. Back through the V60 with the same previous adjustments, and it continues to offer classic Panamanian geisha characteristics with a delicate florality and a citric profile, but it does open up exceptionally well with a sweeter stone fruit sense on the cool down itself. In addition to that, what seems to be recurring is the vanilla-like attributes to this in this kind of creamier sense. So I'm really noticing that once again on this day. And as we continue on to day 38, another try through the Chemex, and it's on this day that I settled with the V60. I was kind of still thinking back and forth which one I preferred, but this cup came out a little bit more tame relative to some of the other experiences. Delicate and bright, there is a stronger focus on the citric attributes through this brew method. It's a strong vanilla that's present yet again, and that's something I'm going to harp on towards the end of this coffee. But there's also a slight passion fruit-like aspect to it. Not necessarily quite as good, but I'm experiencing a fair bit of depth. I mean, these are washed Panamanian geishas, so you're going to be experiencing some great depth and complexity to them as you would expect. Day 40, final notes we have back through the V60, and it was back to the best it had been to this point. And here on day 44, it's every bit as good as it has been on that day 34, day 40 mark, as it's offering more of that strong, creamy vanilla sweetness to it with a complementary tropicality. And let me stop right there, because that very strong creamy vanilla sense reminds me of the Tumaco that we reviewed from Passenger a couple of years ago, which was also a Hacienda La Esmeralda coffee, as those seem to share that one specific characteristic in a much more sweeter sense. And given that this was the most defining factor of this coffee, especially on these days, I was really enjoying it because that made me really enjoy that specific one, and it made me enjoy this cup to a near equal, if not greater measure as well. It does open up beautifully on the cool down with a stone fruit sense, giving it just some great depth in general, and I was really appreciating a lot of what I was experiencing from this coffee. Lived up to the expectations I'd had for it going into it. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 2 level 5s, so let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the cleanliness, level 5. So we have a washed Panamanian geisha. Anytime it doesn't score that level 5, then that's very disappointing. And I do have to say, maybe the higher side of level 5, if not still just that true level 5 with the Chemex. That was the best thing that the Chemex offered for this coffee. But even then, the great clarity and definition that was present in this one right from the onset, it was always going to score that level 5 mark, and that's why the standard for scoring level 5 is so high, because coffees like this do exist. Florality, level 5. So initially I was thinking, is this going to be a classically floral forward cup? But this is much more in the floral vanilla sense. I guess I couldn't necessarily find a better spot to put it in. I didn't want to put in the chocolate attribute because I didn't want this tasting wheel to kind of be misrepresented, as I felt like the vanilla-like attribute, even though it was in much more of a sweeter sense, was maybe a little bit more in line with the florality that complemented the rest of this cup. So that's why I specifically decided to focus it on that area, and that's why the florality reached level 5, because whatever that creamy vanilla attribute of this coffee was, it really seemed to dominate and be the most pronounced characteristic to it. And given that the coffee was just so clean and well defined to begin with, that really stood out for me and justified that level 5 mark. Then we have quite a few level 4s. We'll start with the finish, level 4. Interestingly, on the higher side of the level 4, as this one had a fair bit of a lasting finish to it in a much more stone fruit-like attribute sense, as well as a more subtle floral aspect, and some of the other fruit characteristics, that slight citric and slight berry attributes, most specifically the tropical berry like the passion fruit I had previously mentioned. That's where that finish comes in. And even though it's not necessarily the strongest in terms of intensity, it's that very delicate and long-lasting type of finish. So very much enjoyed that part of this coffee, as well as the sweetness, which scored on the higher side of the level 4. And oftentimes a tasting wheel isn't necessarily a good indicator or representative, like it's not doing this coffee justice, and I feel like that's the case with this one, as the sweetness was definitely on the higher side of that level 4. Not to the extent of the level 5, but specifically that vanilla attribute that was just so sweet within this one. Really enjoyed that part of this coffee. Stone fruit, level 4. I think that might have been the biggest surprise for me, as once again, it wasn't necessarily an overly peachy stone fruit, but rather a slightly more sweeter, sugary stone fruit. So usually when I try to decide or indicate which one it's a little bit more reminiscent of, if it's a little bit more just kind of sugary in a clear sugary sense, I like white peach. If it's a little bit just more kind of sweeter, sugary in a fresh fruit sense, then I opt for a nectarine. And if it's just very much in a fresh fruit sense, then I opt for the peach. So for me, maybe a little bit more in line with that nectarine, but it opens up exceptionally well in that cool down, as I really enjoyed that experience of this coffee in near equal measure to that very strong, sweeter, creamy vanilla aspect. Then we have a couple of level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. That part's fine for me. Once again, I was surprised that this one didn't necessarily have an abundance of brightness. At times, the one grievance I have with this coffee is that it can feel a little toned back in general, and that was demonstrated in the acidity. As I kind of mentioned, a lot of these things aren't necessarily doing this coffee justice, but if there's one thing that I feel like is a very good indicator, it's that the brightness wasn't overly present or prominent within this cup. Berry fruit, Level 3, enough of those subtle kind of passion fruit attributes, not anywhere near as pronounced as the creamy vanilla florality or the stone fruit components. Same thing with the citrus, and I was fine with the citrus not necessarily being the most dominant fruit factor in a Panamanian geisha, as I expected that maybe, especially from the first couple of cups, to be the most pronounced characteristic. So having those both at a level 3 just gives this one substance and a little bit more depth, as opposed to skewing in a direction that I wasn't going to prefer for this coffee. So that's really nice for this one. Last thing worth discussing is the body level one. Extremely delicate and light bodied cup of coffee, and I have no issues with that, as I actually do tend to like that from time to time. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation, if a slight bit of an underrepresentation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. For those that don't know our history with the Hacienda La Esmeralda coffees we've reviewed from, say, the first one we ever had, the Lotte Tumaco, was outstanding, one of my favorite coffees of that year. And then the next year, the Lotte Lino was a pretty notable disappointment for me, as I had so many expectations for it going into it. But this one right here essentially redeemed that, as I feel like this is one of the best Panamanian geishas, specifically from the Peterson estate, that we've had in quite a while. So I think Say did an outstanding job with this coffee. It might suffer from recency bias towards the end of the year, because maybe I won't remember just how much I enjoyed this coffee at the start. But this one right here is easily one of my favorite coffees we've started out the year with, as I found so many positives from it. It offered everything I was looking for: sweetness, clarity, immense clarity, florality, immense florality, and some great fruit attributes, especially in the direction that I prefer. So this one had everything I wanted from a Panamanian geisha, and for that reason, it was an outstanding coffee for me. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to: of course, your Panamanian geisha drinker, and given that I'm your Panamanian geisha drinker, I want to maybe specify specifically the type, and that of course is going to be anybody that finds great reward from a sweeter vanilla-like component to it, because they are different. All of the Panamanian geishas that we've reviewed on this channel, they at least offer something different, some other depth, clarity, or whatever the case is, but this one specifically offered that in a unique sense. And while it was similar to the Tumaco we had from Pasture, there were still enough subtle differences. Most specifically, I want to focus on the stone fruit attribute that was complemented well by the other fruit indicators within this coffee. So that gave it some really nice depth, higher than average sweetness, and of course the clarity that you'd look for and expect from a Panamanian geisha. If those are the things that you look for from one, then I think this is a really good fit, and the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Hacienda La Esmeralda Reina 415 wash processed Panama from Say Coffee. Thank you for watching.